I'd pictured this day countless times. I imagined holding my son, the way his tiny fingers would curl around the neck of my sweater. I'd envisioned my husband's parents, his grandmother and grandfather, finally seeing him, as they'd themselves said, someone worth continuing the line for. I'd even carefully selected a neutral outfit. Nothing flashy, nothing that could be dissected and whispered about later. "Are you ready?" I asked Mark as we pulled up to their house. He nodded, not meeting my gaze. His hands gripped the steering wheel a little too tightly. Their parents' house sat quietly in a Connecticut suburb, neat, bright, with a lawn manicured to perfection. It was the kind of house where everything, it seemed, happened according to their own rules. I took a deep breath and stepped out of the car. The door opened, and it was Evelyn who greeted us. Her eyes first rested on Mark, then on me. Only finally did she turn her attention to our son. "Well," she said, deliberately prolonging the word. "Come in." There wasn't a "he's so small" or a "can I hold him?" Not even a truly warm smile. It was more polite. Richard, Mark's father, was sitting in the living room with a glass of water, rising only halfway to his feet. "So this is him," he said, examining the child as if assessing a purchase. A sharp, unexpected pain tightened in my chest. My son didn't cry. He simply burrowed closer to me, clinging tightly. "His name is Ethan," I said. "We wanted you to meet him properly." Evelyn gave a small nod. "Yes, of course, just..." She paused. "We were expecting him to be different." "Different?" I asked, a little bewildered. "Well, you know," Richard interjected, "family resemblance, eye color, features." I glanced at Mark. He remained silent. And it was then, in that quiet moment, that I realized something profound. It wasn't about the child at all. We were seated around a large dining table, one that, as it turned out, had been laid out with an almost obsessive care, as if awaiting an inspection, not us. Evelyn placed a cup of tea before me, without asking if I wanted sugar. Before Mark, his favorite mug. Before me, a plain one devoid of any design. A small thing. But it's from such small details that the truth always reveals itself. "Is he sleeping all right?" she asked, her gaze drifting past the child, somewhere beyond him. "Yes," I replied. "For his age, he's remarkably calm." Evelyn pursed her lips. "Mark was restless as a child." "All children are different," I said, a touch defensively. Richard cleared his throat. "We just want to be sure everything is as it should be." I tensed. "What do you mean?" He looked at Mark. Mark remained silent. "There are so many stories," Richard continued. "Women who, how would you put it, jump to conclusions." I felt a ringing in my ears. "Are you suggesting you doubt that Ethan is Mark's son?" I asked directly. A silence fell over the room. Evelyn lowered her eyes. Richard didn't break his gaze. "We're simply asking questions," he said. "It's perfectly normal." I looked at Mark. "Are you asking these questions too?" He finally raised his eyes. I don't know," he said softly. "They just want to be sure." Those words struck me with a sharper pain than any accusation. I held my son tighter to me. "Then you need to know something," I said, striving for a calm tone. "I won't allow my child to be treated as a matter of doubt." Evelyn abruptly rose to her feet. "We only want to protect our son." I offered a bitter smile. "And who will protect mine?" In that moment, Ethan began to cry. Loudly, desperately. And no one, except me, attempted to soothe him. We left earlier than we had planned. Mark remained silent for the entire drive. Ethan had fallen asleep almost immediately, as if his small body had finally allowed itself to relax. "You could say something," I murmured, not looking at my husband. "You're taking it too intensely," he responded after a pause. "They're just worried. They're doubting my child. They're doubting the situation," he said carefully. I turned to him. "In what situation, Mark?" He gripped the steering wheel tighter. "You know, there's been a difficult history in our family." "I know about Claire," I said calmly. "You said, serious relationship, almost a wedding. It all ended badly." He nodded. "Yes, But you never explained why they're now looking at my son as a problem. Mark remained silent for far too long. There was a lot of noise, he finally said. Accusations, arguments, fighting. Between whom? He exhaled. Between Claire and my parents. I felt a familiar tension rising within me, that same one that surfaces when you realize you're being told only part of the truth. Was it because of me? Because I wasn't enough? I asked. No, he replied too quickly. It wasn't about you. But I wasn't sure anymore. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying Evelyn's glances, Richard's, and the way the word certain sounded so rehearsed when they spoke. I knew about Claire, but I'd never been interested in the details. Now I was. I took my phone and typed her name into the search. The results appeared almost instantly. Legal documents, old articles in local newspapers. Dispute over custody, family sues for. I felt a coldness slowly creep up my spine. Claire had a child. The lawsuit wasn't about the marriage. It wasn't even about the breakup. It was about paternity. I read on, disbelief growing, accusations, doubts, attempts to declare a child not belonging to the family. The plaintiffs, Richard and Evelyn Hawkins. I put down my phone. Now everything made sense. They hadn't been looking at Ethan for the first time. They'd been comparing him. And I suddenly realized this story had begun long before me. The next morning, I woke up with this unsettling feeling. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It wasn't anger either. It was just clarity. Mark had already gone to work. His coffee mug sat on the kitchen table, half full. He always did this when he didn't want to talk. I was feeding Ethan, watching him wrinkle his nose at the end of the milk, and in that moment, it hit me. If I stayed silent now, it would be the beginning of the end. Not of our marriage, but of my ability to protect my child. My phone vibrated. A message from Evelyn. We'd like to discuss one important matter. I hope you'll consider it rationally. I didn't even bother to ask what it was about. I knew. We met at a cafe not far from their place. A public setting, which meant they were going to be civil. Evelyn was smiling, and Richard held a folder. We've been thinking about this for a long time, she began, and we've decided it's best to go through with it officially. What is it? I asked, keeping my voice even. Richard opened the folder and slid a document across the table. A DNA test. It's just a formality, he said. If you're sure everything's all right, there's nothing to fear. I looked at the paper, then at them. But what if I refuse? I asked calmly. Evelyn took a deep breath, like she was talking to a difficult child. Then we'll have to take other steps. What steps? Richard didn't soften his words. We'll be filing a lawsuit, in Mark's best interests and the child's. I slowly folded the document and returned it to the table. You've been through this before, haven't you? With Claire. Evelyn shuddered. Don't dredge up the past. That's precisely what explains the present, I replied. You don't want the truth, you want control. Richard narrowed his eyes. You're making a mistake. For the first time since Ethan was born, I smiled. Not a warm smile, but a small, resolute one. No, I'm just becoming inconvenient. That evening, I scheduled a consultation with a lawyer. And for the first time since Ethan came into my life, I didn't feel the familiar knot of anxiety. Instead, I felt strength. My friend, Sarah, she works in social services, you know. She's the kind of person who knows exactly where to go when family disputes are hiding behind a veil of care. Advised me to see Mrs. Grant. She'd handled these kinds of cases before, and she had a good reputation for spotting the patterns. You're not the first, nor will you be the last, Mrs. Grant said, flipping through my notes. And unfortunately, not the last. It's important, you know, that's a pattern. They want a DNA test, I said. Through the courts, if necessary. Mrs. Grant nodded. And you're not obligated to agree immediately. But the most important thing is to document everything. Messages, pressure, the phrasing they use. They're veiled threats about the child's best interests. I left her office with the folder clutched in my hand, a clear understanding settling over me. If a war broke out, it would be meticulously documented. When I got home, Mark was waiting for me in the kitchen. "You met with my parents," he said, without preamble. "Yes, why didn't you tell me?" I put down my bag and looked him straight in the eye. "Because you weren't on my side." He took a sharp, ragged breath. "That's unfair." "Then say it," I said softly. "Do you think Ethan isn't my son?" Mark froze. That silence spoke louder than any answer. "I just want things to be calm," he finally said. I nodded. "Me too. That's why I won't let calm be bought with my silence anymore." The next day, I received a letter official, stamped. A notification of intent to file a lawsuit. Evelyn and Richard moved with a speed that was almost unnerving. But they didn't realize one thing. Neither did I. I opened my laptop and began to write a chronology. With dates, with quotes, with facts. This wasn't just a family story anymore. It was a case. And in this case, my son wasn't an object. He was the reason I wouldn't back down. The lawsuit was filed a week later. They handled it with a chilling precision, through carefully worded statements about legitimate doubts and protecting the child's interests. Not a single direct accusation, not a harsh word, just cold calculation. Mark showed me a copy of the documents that evening, avoiding my gaze. "They're confident this is what's best for everyone," he said. "For whom exactly?" I asked. He didn't answer. Rumors began to spread quickly. First, among distant relatives. Then, among mutual acquaintances. Then, in conversations that abruptly cut off the moment I entered a room. I heard there were questions about the child. Each of those whispers was a small, sharp prick, but I'd learned to breathe deeper, to hold my spine straight. I knew it was part of their strategy, to make me nervous, uncertain, mistaken. But I wasn't alone anymore. Mrs. Grant filed a counter-motion regarding psychological coercion, family interference, and an attempt to discredit the mother. "We're not attacking," she said. "We're presenting the context." The hardest conversation was with Mark. "I don't want to take sides," he said, when we sat across from each other at the same table where we'd once discussed baby names. "You've already made your choice," I replied. "You're just afraid to admit it. They're my parents. And Ethan is your son." He covered his face with his hands. "I'm tired." I looked at him, studying him for a long moment. "And I'm tired of being comfortable for everyone but myself." That evening, Claire called. I immediately recognized her voice, calm, a little weary. "They gave me your number," she said. "I thought you might want to talk." We met 2 days later. She was older than in the photos, but there was something familiar in her gaze, the same mixture of exhaustion and strength. "They won't stop on their own," she said. "But they retreat when they see they're no longer in control." I nodded. "I won't let them take my child." Claire offered a faint, almost hesitant smile. "Then you've already won, you just don't know it yet." The preparation for the hearing had taken a month, a relentless month of letters, phone calls, copies, notarized signatures, and sleepless nights. I learned to sleep in fits and starts, to wake at the slightest sound, a habit that seems to cling to mothers forever. Mrs. Grant was calm, precise. "We aren't going to prove that you're a good mother," she said. "That's a trap. We're going to demonstrate that they always behave the same way when they lose control." That's precisely why Claire's testimony was so crucial. She presented a correspondence from a decade ago. The same phrases, the same wording, even the inflections. It was as if Evelyn and Richard had used the same template. "We just want to be sure. It's for the family. Don't resist if you have nothing to hide." As I read those lines, a quiet, clear sense of understanding settled over me. A week before the trial, Mark arrived at our house early. "I was visiting my parents," he said. I simply waited, letting the silence hang. "They offered a compromise," he continued. "If you agree to the test, they'll drop the case." I slowly shook my head. "They don't want the test. They want to set a precedent." "What if it's true?" he blurted out suddenly. "What if you're just afraid?" I rose, walked over to Ethan's crib, and laid my hand on his chest. "I don't fear the truth," I said. I fear the people who use it as a weapon. Mark sank into a chair. I don't know whose side I'm on. I looked at him. Then you aren't on mine. The courtroom was smaller than I'd imagined, unassuming, lacking the grandiosity and drama I'd anticipated. Just facts and a profound quiet. When Claire's turn came, Evelyn paled. Claire spoke with a chilling calmness, without a flicker of emotion, the way someone who's already faced the worst speaks. This isn't about paternity, she said to the judge. It's about control and what happens when you lose it. It always leads to destruction. I noticed Richard, for the first time, looking away. After the hearing, Mrs. Grant offered a small, almost hesitant smile. Now they're defending themselves. I nodded. And for the first time in a long time, I felt it, a sense of approaching closure. 3 days before the final hearing, my phone rang, a number I didn't recognize. "This is Family Services," a woman's voice said on the other end. "We received an anonymous tip and are obligated to conduct a preliminary assessment." A cold knot tightened in my stomach. "What kind of signal?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Concerns regarding the emotional stability of the mother and the living conditions of the child." I closed my eyes. They'd done it, finally. The inspection was formal, but profoundly humiliating. The woman moved through the apartment with a detached scrutiny, asking questions, recording my answers. Ethan slept peacefully, as if instinctively knowing that the priority now was not to weep. "Do you have support?" she asked as she prepared to leave. "Yes," I replied quietly. "I have myself." She held her gaze on me a fraction of a second longer than necessary, a subtle inclination of her head. "That's evident." That evening, Mark arrived consumed by anger. "You know what they've done?" he demanded. "Yes," I said, keeping my expression even. "And you, of course, know." He paced the room like a caged animal. "They've crossed the line." I looked at him calmly. "That line was crossed long ago. You're simply now noticing it." He paused, a flicker of something confusion, perhaps, in his eyes. "I'll speak to them." "No," I said, my voice firm. "It's unnecessary now." That night, Evelyn wrote to me directly. "You're destroying the family. If you were smarter, you would have agreed and it would have ended quietly." I reread the message several times, the words burning into my memory. Then, without hesitation, I forwarded it to Mrs. Grant. "That's precisely what we needed," she said on the phone, her voice devoid of emotion. "It's confirmation." The next day, Mark packed his belongings. "I need to think," he said, his voice flat. I didn't stop him. Sometimes justice begins in the quiet spaces of loneliness. On the day of the final hearing, I awoke before my alarm. Ethan slept sprawled out, his arms outstretched as if he occupied the entire world. And in that moment, I understood that whatever transpired today, I had already achieved the most important thing. I hadn't yielded. The courtroom was almost empty. Evelyn and Richard sat side by side, impeccably dressed, bearing that familiar expression I now recognized instantly. A blend of unwavering confidence and simmering irritation. They resented when the narrative slipped beyond their control. Mark sat alone, not beside me, not near them, between. The judge listened attentively to both sides. Documents, correspondence, chronology. When Mrs. Grant presented Evelyn's messages, a silence descended upon the room. "If you were smarter, it could have all ended quietly." "Did you send this message?" the judge inquired. Evelyn's face drained of color. "I was under extreme stress," she said. "It was emotionally charged." "It was pressure," Mrs. Grant replied calmly, "and the attempt to involve social services without merit." Richard raised his voice for the first time. "We simply wanted to protect our son." The judge raised his hand. "Protection does not manifest as systematic interference and the discredit of a child's mother." The verdict was read swiftly. The lawsuit dismissed. The claims deemed unfounded. The warning formal. But most importantly, the phrase embedded in the text of the ruling, a memory I would carry forever. The court observes a recurring pattern of psychological pressure in the actions of the plaintiffs. I felt the tension, accumulated over months, finally release its grip. As I stepped out, Mark caught up to me. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice low. "I should have stood by you sooner." I looked at him, a long, considering gaze. "Sooner when?" He didn't answer. And in that silence, there was more truth than in all his previous excuses. The house was quiet again. Not the unsettling silence of anticipation, a held breath waiting for a blow, but a quietness like the aftermath of a storm, clean and settled. Mark moved out a week after the verdict. No drama. No accusations. We talked about the mundane, about his schedule with Ethan, about small things. But about the important things, there was nothing. Sometimes silence speaks louder than any words. Richard and Evelyn hadn't written or called. They hadn't even reached out. Their silence was an admission of defeat. I often found myself thinking back to that first day, to the way they'd looked at my son, as if he were a mistake. Now I understood. It wasn't him who was the error. It was their conviction, their belief that they had the right to dictate the lives of others. Claire would occasionally send me messages. We never became friends, but a strange, adult understanding blossomed between us. We'd both walked different paths, but through similar landscapes. "You were braver than me," she wrote once. I replied honestly. I was ready. Ethan was growing. He'd smile when he saw me. He'd reach out and grab my hand. And he'd never, not once, ever make me question my place in the world. One day, walking past that very cafe where they'd first offered me the paper with the DNA test, I suddenly realized I didn't feel the bitterness anymore. Just a profound relief. I didn't deliver a grand, public reckoning. I didn't tear their lives apart. I simply refused to let them break mine. Justice doesn't always look like a victory. Sometimes it just looks like a morning without fear. A child sleeping peacefully in their crib. A woman who doesn't need to explain or justify herself. And that, I realized, was more than enough.